A woman with terminal cancer overheard whispers between her husband and her mother-in-law. The next morning, she woke up frightened and alone inside an abandoned cemetery. Dr. Mitchell's office exuded that typical hospital aroma, that mixed disinfectant with the silent weight of human suffering. Susan nervously adjusted her navy blue skirt while observing the gray-haired doctor flip through her test results with an expression she had never seen in 15 years of appointments. Her delicate hands, always so skilled at embroidery and cooking, trembled slightly as she held the strap of her crocheted purse like an anchor amid an approaching storm. Susan's brown eyes, normally radiant and full of life, now desperately searched for some sign of hope on the face of the man who held her fate among those papers. "Doctor, based on my test results, is there any hope for improvement?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Dr. Mitchell looked up over his reading glasses and sighed deeply, like a man who had carried the weight of delivering bad news for decades. He was a man in his early 50s, with wrinkles that told stories of difficult diagnoses and premature goodbyes. His hands calloused from the tireless work of trying to save lives he couldn't always preserve. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the dark wooden desk, and for a moment hesitated, as if the words he was about to pronounce could somehow become less devastating if he kept them for a few more seconds. The heavy silence that hung between them was charged with a tension that made the office air seem dense and suffocating. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Susan, we need to talk about very difficult realities," he replied, choosing each word with the care of someone who knew he was about to destroy an entire world. Susan felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath her feet as she watched the doctor organize the papers in his hands with slow, deliberate movements. She noticed how he avoided direct eye contact, fixing his gaze on the results, as if the numbers and technical words written there could somehow soften the impact of what he was about to reveal. Her own hands began to grow cold with sweat, and she squeezed the purse strap even tighter, feeling the crochet beads press against her fingers in a way that minimally reassured her. The distant noise from the hospital corridor, with people walking and talking about their normal lives, seemed to come from another universe, a place where death had not yet knocked at the door with such cruelty. "The results show that the cancer has spread far beyond what we initially expected," continued Dr. Mitchell, making a painful pause. "I'm afraid to inform you that this is a terminal situation, with a prognosis of approximately 3 to 6 months to live." The words hit Susan like lightning in a devastating storm, causing her entire world to collapse in slow motion before her eyes. She felt as if she were falling into an infinite abyss where each syllable uttered by the doctor echoed in her mind like funeral bells announcing her end. Her hands, which had always been her pride for their ability to create beautiful things, now trembled uncontrollably as she tried to process the information she had just received. The black silky hair she always kept in an elegant bun began to come loose, some strands falling over her face as if even her body was beginning to fall apart in the face of the cruel revelation. Silent tears began to stream down her tanned cheeks, carrying with them all the dreams and plans she had built for a future she now discovered did not exist. "This can't be happening to me, doctor," she murmured, her voice broken with emotion. "I still have so much to live for, so many plans, so many dreams." Dr. Mitchell rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the busy street, where life continued its normal course, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding inside that office. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to fighting against death, but who had learned over the years that it wasn't always possible to win that battle, a reality that tormented him with each terminal diagnosis he had to deliver. His broad back, slightly curved by the weight of his profession, carried not only his own pain but also the pain of all the patients he couldn't save. When he turned to Susan again, his eyes were moist, revealing the humanity he always tried to hide behind the professional mask that protected him emotionally. "We can implement some palliative treatments to control the pain and provide more quality of life in the time that remains," he said, sitting back down. "The most important thing now is that you enjoy every precious moment with the people who love you and whom you love." Susan left the doctor's office walking as if in a trance, her steps echoing on the cold ceramic corridor of the hospital in a way that seemed to mark a cruel and relentless countdown. The corridor, with its walls painted in a faded green, and the constant coming and going of people concerned with their own pain, seemed like a labyrinth with no exit from which she would never be able to escape. She held the test results against her chest, as if those papers could somehow contain all the pain she felt, exploding inside her like an emotional bomb. People passed by her talking about everyday problems, trivial complaints and concerns that now seemed absurdly insignificant given the magnitude of what she had just discovered about her own mortality. How am I going to tell David and Diane? She thought, feeling the crushing weight of the revelation. They will give me the support and love I so need right now. The bus journey to her home transformed into a tortuous journey through a waking nightmare, where each pothole in the road made her stomach churn, and each traffic light seemed like a cruel pause that prolonged her agony. Susan looked through the window, blurred by the rain that had begun to fall. Observing the colorful houses of her neighborhood that had always filled her with joy and now looked like scenes from a movie to which she no longer belonged. Children played carelessly on the sidewalks, street vendors shouted their offers enthusiastically, and life pulsed vigorously on every corner, creating a painful contrast with the emptiness that now inhabited her heart, like a black hole. Her hands continued to tremble as she held her purse tightly, trying to find some kind of emotional stability in a world that had become completely chaotic. "When I get home, David will hug me and tell me we'll face this together," she murmured to herself, trying to find hope. "My family will give me all the strength I need to fight against this." Upon opening the door to her house, Susan was greeted by the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the sound of the television on in the living room, comforting signs of a domestic routine that now acquired a completely different and desperately precious meaning. David was sitting in his favorite brown leather armchair, a 40-year-old man with broad shoulders, from hard work and dark hair that was beginning to show some gray strands at the temples, evidence of time passing inexorably. He wore his worn blue t-shirt and jeans, the casual uniform he always wore on weekends, but there was something profoundly different in his posture, a tension that she couldn't completely identify, but that made her feel a strange chill down her spine. When he raised his dark eyes to greet her, Susan noticed a coldness she had never seen before, as if he were looking at an inconvenient stranger who had invaded his personal space. "David, love, I need to talk to you about something very important," she said, trying to keep her voice controlled. "It's about the results of my tests that came out today." David pressed the remote control button to lower the volume of the television, but he didn't get up to hug her, as he always did when he noticed something was worrying her or when she returned from important medical appointments. Instead, he settled even more deeply into his armchair, as if he were preparing to receive information that he had expected for a long time, but that he preferred to avoid at all costs for reasons she couldn't understand. His large hands, calloused from work in the mechanic shop, remained completely motionless on the arms of the chair, without making the slightest movement toward his wife, who clearly needed comfort and emotional support. The eyes that once made her fall hopelessly in love, that used to shine when he looked at her, now observed her with a calculated and cold distance, as if he were evaluating a complicated mechanical problem instead of showing concern for the health of the woman with whom he had promised to share his entire life. "What did the doctor say this time?" he asked without showing any emotion. "I hope it's nothing too complicated, because we have several practical issues to resolve here at home." At that moment, Diane emerged from the kitchen like an ominous shadow, carrying a tray with coffee cups that she placed on the center table with mechanical and extremely calculated movements. She was a woman of well-lived 60 years, with gray hair always tied in a tight bun that made her appear more severe than she actually was, and small but penetrating eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating and judging everything around her with surgical precision. Her dark, impeccably pressed clothes gave her an appearance of unquestionable authority, as if she were a commanding figure who had taken complete control of the house without any invitation or authorization. When she looked at Susan, her thin lips contracted in an expression that mixed poorly disguised impatience with something that seemed strangely close to satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for that specific moment for a long time. "Susan, dear, you look terribly downcast today," Diane commented with fake concern in her voice. I sincerely hope it's nothing that will cause us unnecessary worries or additional complications." Susan took a deep breath, trying to find courage in the depths of her being to pronounce the words that would change everything forever in their lives. She looked at the husband she had loved for 15 years, the man who had promised to be by her side in sickness and in health, for better or worse, and then at her mother-in-law who, despite all their personality differences and small domestic frictions, had always been an integral part of her family. The words seemed as heavy as stones in her throat, each syllable loaded with the devastating weight of a reality that she herself still desperately struggled to accept and process. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hold back with all her strength, hoping that her extreme vulnerability would awaken some kind of natural compassion and unconditional support from the two most important people in her life. The room, with its cheerful yellow walls and furniture that she had chosen with such care and love throughout the years of marriage, suddenly seemed like a solemn courtroom where she was about to pronounce her own death sentence. "Dr. Mitchell informed me that the cancer has spread much more extensively than any of us expected," she said with a trembling voice. "He told me that I have only 3 to 6 months to live." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening, a heavy and suffocating void that seemed to suck all the air from the room and leave only a somber echo of the devastating words that had been pronounced. David remained completely still in his armchair, making no movement to get up and comfort his wife, who had just received a cruel and merciless death sentence. His eyes, instead of filling with tears or showing genuine shock, seemed to be processing the information in a calculated and cold manner, as if he were making complex mental calculations instead of feeling emotional pain for the imminent loss of the woman he supposedly loved. Diane stopped fiddling with the coffee cups and became completely static, but on her face was an expression that Susan couldn't completely decipher, something that oscillated between poorly rehearsed theatrical surprise and a subtle and disturbing satisfaction that made her question if she was having hallucinations caused by emotional trauma. "David, aren't you going to say absolutely anything?" she pleaded, desperately seeking any sign of human emotion. "Diane, please, say something, anything." David finally moved, but it was only to scratch his beard for a few seconds and sigh in a way that suggested more irritation and impatience than deep sadness or genuine concern, as if his wife's devastating news was a minor inconvenience that had interrupted his relaxing plans for the weekend. He looked at Susan with an expression she had never seen in 15 years of marriage, a disconcerting mixture of poorly disguised impatience and something that seemed dangerously close to relief, as if an extremely complex and persistent problem he had been secretly facing for months had finally found a definitive and convenient solution. His hands drummed nervously on the arm of the chair, not from emotional anxiety or loving concern, but as if he were secretly eager to end that uncomfortable conversation and move on to other much more important and interesting activities. "Well, if that's what the specialist doctors said with all certainty, then that's exactly what's going to happen," he declared with a coldness that cut her heart. "There's absolutely no point in us sitting here dramatically lamenting about things we cannot change." Diane approached Susan, but not to offer a comforting hug or words of emotional support in such a devastatingly difficult moment. Instead, she began systematically collecting Susan's personal items that were scattered around the room, as if already meticulously preparing the house for a new reality where her daughter-in-law would no longer be present to interfere with her plans. Her movements were surprisingly fast and extremely efficient, like someone who was executing a plan that had been carefully and secretly developed long before this crucial moment. She picked up Susan's favorite books, her ornamental plants that decorated the window with such charm, and even the delicately embroidered cushions she had made with her own hands over the years, systematically placing everything in a cardboard box, as if she were doing a complete and definitive cleaning. The cruel and devastating symbolism of those actions did not go unnoticed by Susan, who felt as if her own existence was being deliberately erased in real time before her incredulous eyes. "Diane, what exactly are you doing with all my personal things?" she questioned with a desperate voice. "Why are you putting everything away as if I were already dead and buried?" Diane momentarily paused her organizing activities and looked at Susan with an expression that mixed false maternal compassion with a cold and calculated efficiency that chilled the sick woman's blood to the bones. She held the box with Susan's personal belongings firmly against her chest, as if protecting extremely valuable treasures from being reclaimed by their rightful owner. Her small but incisive eyes methodically scanned the entire room, mentally evaluating each piece of furniture, each decoration and each object, as if she were already planning a complete renovation that would be implemented as soon as Susan was no longer present to interfere with or question her authoritarian decisions. The way she smiled, a small and almost imperceptible smile at the corners of her thin lips, was like a deep and painful stab in the heart of a woman who was already suffering far beyond any measure considered humanly bearable. "Dear Susan, we need to be absolutely practical and realistic about these inevitable things," she said with a false and disturbing sweetness. "It simply makes no sense at all to leave the house completely messy when we need to adequately prepare for the future that awaits us." Susan felt her legs dangerously weaken and had to lean on the sofa to avoid completely collapsing on the floor as the brutal and cruel reality of the situation began to penetrate her mind like thousands of sharp knives cutting simultaneously. She looked desperately around the room that had been her loving home for so many precious years, observing with growing horror how David and Diane behaved as if she were already an invisible ghost, an extremely inconvenient presence that was significantly hindering their secret plans for a completely new life without her. The woman who had always been the loving, beating heart of that home, who cooked each meal with genuine love, who decorated each corner with infinite affection, and who transformed those simple walls into a truly warm home, was now treated as an unwanted intruder who should silently prepare for her own definitive departure. The tears she had managed to hold back with such effort finally began to flow freely down her face, not only because of the terminal illness that was inexorably consuming her, but mainly because of the devastating emotional betrayal that was being coldly executed by the two people she loved most in the entire world. "I just received a terrible death sentence, and you're acting as if I were already dead," she sobbed desperately. "Where is all the love, emotional support and care that I desperately expected to find here?" David finally rose from his armchair, but it was only to grab the remote control and significantly increase the television volume, as if the conversation about his wife's imminent and painful death was infinitely less interesting and important than the sports program being broadcast. He deliberately turned up the sound, creating an insurmountable sound barrier that made any attempt at deeper or more meaningful emotional communication completely impossible. His broad shoulders were visibly tense, not from genuine pain or loving concern, but clearly from growing irritation, as if Susan's anguished presence there in the room was a significant obstacle to his planned Sunday relaxation. When she desperately tried to approach him, seeking any microscopic sign that the man who had promised to love her eternally still existed somewhere hidden behind that cold and cruel facade, he deliberately moved away physically, carefully avoiding any contact that could remotely suggest intimacy or conjugal affection. "Susan, you're being excessively dramatic and theatrical about this whole situation," he said without even looking in her direction. "If this is really what will inevitably happen, then let's deal with this reality like completely responsible and mature adults." Diane methodically finished storing all of Susan's personal belongings and went directly to the kitchen, from where systematic sounds immediately began coming of drawers being opened and closed forcefully, dishes being reorganized with military efficiency, and completely frantic activity that suggested a deep and definitive cleaning being carried out with exceptional urgency. She hummed softly a cheerful song that Susan couldn't identify, a surprisingly jovial melody that contrasted in an absolutely grotesque and disturbing way with the devastating tragedy that had just been dramatically revealed in the living room. The rhythmic sound of Diane's firm and determined footsteps echoed throughout the entire house like hammers methodically building a coffin, each movement precisely calculated to systematically and definitively remove any trace of Susan's presence even before she had really left this cruel world. Occasionally, she shouted from the kitchen seemingly innocent comments about household organization and administrative efficiency, as if she were giving an educational lecture on how to perfectly manage a home without unnecessary and counterproductive interference. "Susan, when you feel a little better and more willing, we can talk in detail about better organizing all your medications," Diane shouted from the kitchen with false maternal concern. "We definitely don't want them scattered messily around the house, disrupting the natural order of things." The phone rang abruptly, cutting through the heavy and suffocating environment that had settled like a toxic cloud in the room, and David immediately stood up with surprising quickness to answer it, as if that specific call was a divine salvation that would completely free him from the social obligation of dealing with his dying wife's devastating emotions. Susan observed with growing suspicion her husband walking to the telephone with remarkably hurried and almost anxious steps, as if he had been waiting for that particular call for a long time and with great expectation. She noticed with alarm how he quickly and discreetly checked if she was paying attention to his movements, before significantly lowering his voice and turning his back completely to her, creating a physical and psychological barrier that clearly suggested that the conversation he was about to have was definitely not for her curious ears. The peculiar way he held the phone, pressing it firmly against his ear and curving his entire body as if he were protecting extremely important and confidential secrets, sent an inexplicable chill down Susan's spine, who began to suspect with growing certainty that there was much more secretly happening in her own home than she had ever perceived or imagined. Who could be calling at such a delicate and difficult moment like this, she thought, carefully observing her husband's suspicious movements. Why is David acting so badly? Susan silently and carefully approached the door that separated the living room from the kitchen, desperately trying to listen to David's telephone conversation without being noticed or discovered. Her heart was beating so violently that she sincerely feared the sound might betray her investigative presence, but she urgently needed to understand why her husband was being so mysterious and secretive at a time when she most desperately needed complete transparency and unconditional support. She managed to catch fragments of the conversation, isolated words and incomplete phrases that gradually began to form an extremely disturbing and alarming pattern in her mind, already severely shaken by the devastating medical revelation of the day. David spoke in a purposely low voice, but there was a palpable urgency and poorly disguised anxiety in his tone that she had never heard before in 15 years of marriage, as if he were discussing matters of extreme importance that definitely had no relation to his wife's deteriorating health or her emotional well-being. "Yes, the doctor confirmed it's just a few months indeed," whispered David on the phone, believing he was completely out of his wife's hearing range. "Now it's really just a matter of time before we can finally proceed with all our plans." The early morning hours weighed on the house like a suffocating cloak, and Susan remained lying in her bed, unable to find any peace in the sleep she so desperately sought after the devastating day she had experienced. The silence of the house was broken only by the relentless tick-tock of the clock on the wall, each passing second sounding like a cruel countdown that constantly reminded her of her newly discovered mortality. Dr. Mitchell's words echoed incessantly in her mind like a terrible mantra, mixing with David and Diane's cold and calculated reactions that had left her more shaken than the terminal diagnosis itself. She turned from side to side in bed, trying to find a position that would alleviate not only the growing physical discomfort, but especially the emotional pain that seemed to consume every fiber of her being, like a devastating fire that gave no respite. "How will I manage to sleep after everything that happened today?" she thought, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. "Why do I feel there's something much more sinister happening in this house?" Thirst began to irritate her dry throat, a basic physical need that had become more intense due to the emotional stress and tears she had shed throughout the afternoon and early evening. Susan slowly got up from the bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor that felt like ice against her skin, warmed by the low fever that accompanied her medical condition. She put on her light blue cotton robe, the same one she had worn for years, and that always brought her comfort in difficult moments, but which now seemed just a fragile protection against the cold she felt not only in her body, but mainly in her soul. Each movement was carefully calculated to make no noise and wake David, who had retired to the bedroom several hours earlier without even giving her a good-night kiss or asking how she was feeling after the devastating revelations of the day. "I need water, but I don't want to wake anyone," she whispered softly to herself. "Perhaps the silence of dawn will help me process all of this more clearly." Susan opened the bedroom door with extreme care, turning the doorknob slowly to avoid any creaking that might betray her presence to the other residents of the house. The hallway was plunged into almost total darkness, illuminated only by the faint light coming from the kitchen, where apparently someone had left a small lamp lit above the sink. She began walking toward the kitchen with cautious and silent steps, her bare feet sliding softly over the cold floor, each step calculated to not produce any sound that might disturb what she believed to be David and Diane's deep sleep. As she approached the kitchen, a strange sensation began to grow in her chest, a disturbing intuition that something wasn't quite right, as if the air around her was loaded with secrets and tensions she couldn't fully identify. "Why do I feel like I'm walking towards something that could change everything?" she questioned internally. "Is this sense of danger real, or just paranoia caused by the trauma of the diagnosis?" As she approached the kitchen entrance, Susan heard low, whispering voices that immediately made her heart race and her entire body go into maximum alert. She instantly recognized the voices of David and Diane, who were conversing in conspiratorial tones, carefully modulated not to be heard, a discovery that made her stop abruptly in the hallway, as if struck by lightning. The realization that they were awake and secretly conversing in the early morning hours, at a time when they believed she would be sleeping deeply, sent a wave of suspicion and fear through her entire body like an icy electrical current. She carefully positioned herself behind the wall separating the hallway from the kitchen, hiding in the shadows like a spy in her own home, trying to hear what was being discussed with such secrecy and urgency. "What the hell are they doing awake, talking in secret at this hour?" she thought, feeling her heart racing. "And why do I have the terrible feeling that this conversation has everything to do with me?" David's voice reached her like a conspiratorial whisper, loaded with an urgency she had never heard before, a tonality that revealed anxiety, excitement, and something that seemed dangerously close to poorly disguised greed. Susan pressed herself even more against the wall, trying to catch every word of the conversation that was happening a few meters away, her heart beating so hard that she feared the sound might betray her investigative presence. The words she began to hear made her blood freeze in her veins, each sentence like a deep stab in a heart that was already bleeding from the emotional wounds of the previous day. She realized they were discussing matters that were definitely not meant for her ears, secrets that had been carefully guarded, and that were now being revealed in the privacy of the early morning hours. "Diane, now that we're certain about the time she has left, we need to accelerate our plans," said David, with barely contained urgency. "The house she inherited from her parents is worth a fortune in the current market, and the life insurance will give us complete financial freedom." Diane responded with a voice that distilled poorly disguised satisfaction, a tone that made Susan feel as if she were hearing strangers discuss the death of someone they didn't know personally. The mother-in-law, who had always shared meals and family moments with her, was now talking about her imminent death with a disturbing naturalness that revealed a completely unknown side of her personality. Susan had to cover her mouth with her own hands to keep from letting out a scream of horror at what she was hearing, her legs trembling so much that she needed to lean against the wall to avoid collapsing to the floor. The woman she had always considered a second mother now revealed herself as someone completely different from what she had imagined during all those years of living together. "David, my son, this is truly the answer to all our prayers," replied Diane with a satisfaction that froze Susan's blood. "Finally, we can get rid of all the problems she has always brought us and live in peace." David continued revealing details that showed long-term planning, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Susan listened with growing horror as he talked about selling the house she had inherited from her deceased parents, the property that represented not just financial value, but all the precious memories of her childhood. The way he discussed the sale as if it were merely a commercial transaction without any sentimental value made her feel as if she were being stripped not only of her possessions, but of her entire personal history. It was as if they were planning to systematically erase all traces of her existence, transforming her into just an obstacle that would finally be removed. "We can sell everything immediately after the funeral and finally have the life we always deserved," said David with evident greed. "No more interference, no more limitations, no more constant drama." Diane chuckled softly, a sound that was like nails scratching glass to Susan's ears, revealing a sadistic joy at the prospect of her premature death. The woman who had received birthday gifts lovingly made by Susan's hands was now discreetly celebrating the prospect of her death, as if it were a long-desired personal achievement. Susan felt as if all the reality she knew was unraveling before her eyes, as if she had never really known the people with whom she had shared her life for so many years. "And we can't forget that she has always been a real nuisance in our lives, David," said Diane with a cruelty that cut deep. "Always interfering in everything, always wanting to control every decision, always preventing us from being who we really are." The following words were like knives being repeatedly plunged into her already torn heart, revealing levels of cruelty she never imagined could exist in the hearts of the people who supposedly loved her. David and Diane began to discuss not only the financial aspects of her death, but also revealed feelings of resentment that had been hidden during years of apparently harmonious coexistence. Susan discovered that her presence had been seen as a heavy burden, a constant source of problems that would finally be removed. The woman who had always strived to be a loving wife, who had taken care of the house with dedication and tried to keep the family united, now discovered that all her efforts had been not only despised, but actively resented. "She never let us live our way, Mother," admitted David coldly. "Always with those organization quirks, always criticizing our friends, always making a drama out of anything." Diane agreed enthusiastically, revealing how she had observed every aspect of Susan's personality that bothered her, as if she were a critic analyzing an inadequate performance. The mother-in-law, who had always smiled to her face, now revealed years of accumulated resentment and silent judgments she had stored like poison in her heart. Susan listened as Diane described her generous and caring personality as negative traits, as if the kindness she had always shown was a serious flaw deserving punishment. "Always thinking you're better than us, always trying to teach us how to live," Diane complained bitterly. "Now we can finally be free to make our own choices without having to put up with your constant judgments." David then revealed what was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire conversation, admitting that he had felt trapped in the marriage for years but had been unable to take any action. Susan listened as he described his relationship with her as a sacrifice he had made due to social obligations he considered unnecessary. It was a revelation that completely redefined her understanding, not only of her marriage, but of her entire identity as a loved woman. The love she had always believed to be mutual had been merely a social performance maintained for convenience. "Mom, you can't imagine the relief I feel being able to speak openly about this," David said emotionally. "For years I felt guilty, but now I realize the problem was never mine." The conversation evolved into details about how they planned to handle the final period of Susan's life, revealing a calculated coldness that made her realize her death was being anticipated as an administrative event to be managed efficiently. They discussed practical matters related to the funeral and inheritance, with a naturalness that suggested they had thought about these issues long before the diagnosis had been revealed. Susan realized that her illness hadn't created these feelings, but simply provided an opportunity for long-cherished wishes to finally be fulfilled without guilt. "We need to behave like the husband and mother-in-law devastated by loss," Diane said with calculated efficiency. "No one can suspect our true feelings about this liberating situation." David agreed about the need to maintain appropriate public appearances, revealing how they had planned to play roles of grieving family members while secretly celebrating their liberation. Susan realized that even her funeral would be a theatrical performance, where those who hated her most would pretend love and longing to keep their social reputation intact. It was a betrayal that extended beyond her life, contaminating even the memory that would remain of her, transforming her departure into an elaborate farce where false tears would be shed over her coffin by people who would be secretly celebrating. "We'll have to be convincing in our public mourning," David said with cynicism that shattered her. "No one can suspect that we're actually celebrating our definitive liberation." Susan was so absorbed in listening to the devastating details of the conversation that she didn't notice how her emotions were affecting her physical stability, her legs trembling uncontrollably due to emotional shock. Each revelation was like a punch that left her weaker and more disoriented, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal while her body reacted with symptoms of extreme stress. The woman who had always prided herself on her emotional strength now found herself completely shattered by a reality that surpassed her worst nightmares about rejection and abandonment. When she finally decided she had heard enough to understand the complete extent of the betrayal, she tried to move away from the wall and silently return to her room. But her emotional state had significantly compromised her coordination. "I need to get out of here before they discover me," she thought desperately. "But how will I get back to the room when I can barely stand?" When Susan tried to take the first step away from her listening position, her bare foot slipped on the cold floor, and she completely lost her balance, stumbling and bumping against a small wooden bench that was leaning against the hallway wall. The object fell with a dull noise that echoed through the silent house like thunder on a quiet night, a sound that instantly cut off the whispering conversation happening in the kitchen and replaced it with an absolute and tense silence that seemed charged with imminent danger. Susan felt her heart stop for a complete moment, before beginning to beat so rapidly that she feared it could be heard meters away, her breathing becoming breathless and desperate as she realized she had been discovered in her act of involuntary espionage. "What the hell was that noise?" David asked with a suddenly alert and suspicious voice. "I thought she was sleeping deeply after all the drama today." The silence that followed was deafening and threatening, a heavy void that seemed to presage terrible consequences for her accidental discovery. Susan remained completely still on the hallway floor, desperately trying to control her agitated breathing, and hoping that perhaps they could attribute the noise to some natural cause like the wind or a pet, any explanation that didn't involve her conscious and investigative presence. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of chairs being pushed back and footsteps beginning to move toward the hallway, where she was hiding, a sound that filled her with absolute terror about what might happen if they discovered she had listened to the devastating conversation she had just witnessed. "Diane, go check where that noise came from," David ordered, with an urgency that revealed his concern. "If she heard our conversation, we'll have serious problems to solve very quickly." The terror that seized Susan upon hearing the footsteps approaching the hallway where she lay was like an electric impulse that ran through her entire body, giving her a desperate strength she didn't know she still possessed in her weakened state. Without thinking about the consequences or risks she might face on the deserted streets before dawn, she rose from the floor with surprising agility and ran toward the front door, her bare feet making the least possible noise against the cold floor of the house she no longer considered her home. The fear of being confronted by David and Diane at that moment, when she had just discovered the full extent of their betrayal and cruelty, was greater than any concern for her physical safety on the dark and dangerous city streets. She needed to escape that toxic environment before they could invent some excuse for their conversation, or worse yet, realize from her devastated expression that she had heard every cruel word they had pronounced about her imminent death. "I need to get out of this house right now, before they see me like this," she thought desperately. "I can't face them knowing everything I've discovered about their true feelings." Susan opened the front door with extreme care, turning the key in the lock with slow and precise movements to avoid any noise that might alert David and Diane to her desperate escape. The cold dawn air hit her face like an icy slap, making her realize for the first time that she was leaving home wearing only her thin cotton robe and house slippers, completely unprepared to face the night climate that proved more rigorous than she had anticipated. But the urgency to escape that environment of betrayal and falsehood was much greater than any physical discomfort she might experience, and she moved forward without looking back, leaving behind not only the house where she had lived for 15 years, but also all the illusions she had nurtured about the love and loyalty of the people she considered her family. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the definitive end of a chapter in her life, marking the moment when she became a refugee from her own home. "This may be the last time I leave this house," she murmured to herself, looking back just once, "but I'd rather die alone on the streets than live another minute with these people who hate me." The neighborhood streets were completely deserted at that early morning hour, illuminated only by yellowish lampposts that created circles of clarity interspersed with stretches of deep darkness that seemed like abysses ready to swallow any lost soul who dared walk there. Susan began to walk without a defined destination, her steps echoing in a lonely and melancholic way on the cold asphalt, each sound amplified by the absolute silence that dominated the sleeping city. The night wind blew through the trees with a ghostly whisper that seemed to carry voices from beyond, indecipherable murmurs that made her question whether she was beginning to have auditory hallucinations caused by the extreme emotional trauma she had just experienced. Her legs trembled, not just from the cold penetrating through the thin fabric of her robe, but mainly from the psychological shock of discovering that the two people she trusted most in the world had spent years secretly wishing for her death and planning how to financially benefit from her departure. "Where am I going?" she questioned herself, realizing she was walking without any direction. "What will I do now that I've discovered my own family considers me a burden that needs to be eliminated?" As she walked through the empty streets, Susan felt as if she were floating in an alternative reality, where all the certainties she had built throughout her life had been brutally destroyed in a single devastating night. The old mansions of the neighborhood, with their imposing facades and well-kept gardens, seemed to observe her with cruel indifference, like silent witnesses to her personal degradation, who preferred not to get involved in human tragedies that didn't concern them. Each step she took led her further from the false security of her old life, and closer to an uncertain future where she would have to face her imminent mortality without the support of absolutely anyone who genuinely cared about her well-being. The terminal diagnosis she had received at Dr. Mitchell's office now seemed almost secondary, compared to the devastating discovery that she had lived for years in an environment of falsehood and resentment disguised as family love. "Perhaps it's better to die alone than to live surrounded by people who pretend to love me," she thought, feeling cold tears run down her cheeks. "At least this way my death will be honest, without theatrical performances of false mourning." The residential neighborhood gradually gave way to a more commercial and then industrial area, where buildings became more spaced out and street lighting scarcer, creating an increasingly somber and threatening environment that perfectly reflected the devastated emotional state in which Susan found herself. Her physical strength began to diminish significantly due to the combination of her debilitating medical condition, the extreme emotional stress she had experienced, and the prolonged walk in adverse weather conditions without adequate food or hydration. She noticed that her breathing was becoming more laborious and irregular. Her heartbeats accelerated and erratic, and a growing dizziness that made the world around her oscillate as if she were on a boat on the high seas during a violent storm. The cancer that silently corroded her body from within now seemed to be taking an even greater toll due to the additional psychological trauma she had suffered, as if the emotional betrayal had accelerated the physical deterioration that was already in progress. "My body can't handle this situation anymore," she murmured, leaning on a lamppost to avoid falling. "But my heart is much more wounded than any tumor could cause." As she continued her desperate and directionless walk, Susan passed a series of closed commercial establishments, with their metal doors lowered and dark windows that looked like dead eyes observing her night passage with an indifference that mirrored the coldness she had found in her own home. A bakery, a pharmacy, a clothing store, all these places that during the day pulsed with life and human activity now presented themselves as abandoned sets of a horror film, creating an atmosphere of urban desolation that perfectly matched the emotional emptiness she felt, growing inside her chest like a black hole consuming any trace of hope or joy that might still exist in her shattered spirit. The echo of her steps on the deserted sidewalks created a hypnotic and melancholic rhythm that seemed like an anticipated funeral march, an appropriate soundtrack for someone who had discovered she was walking alone towards death, while those who should mourn her were already secretly celebrating her imminent departure. "These empty streets are more welcoming than my own home," she thought bitterly. "At least here no one is pretending to love me while planning my death." After walking for more than 2 hours through the sleeping city, Susan reached a peripheral area where houses became more sparse and old, some in a state of partial abandonment, with gardens invaded by wild vegetation and dark windows suggesting they had been unoccupied for a long time. Public lighting in this region was practically non-existent, forcing her to walk guided only by the faint light of the moon that occasionally managed to penetrate through the heavy clouds covering the sky like a funeral shroud. Her breathing was becoming increasingly difficult and broken, her steps more faltering and uncertain, and she began to notice that her vision was getting blurred at the edges, clear signs that her body was reaching the limit of its physical and emotional resistance. The combination of extreme fatigue, psychological trauma, debilitating medical condition, and prolonged exposure to the night cold was creating a perfect storm that threatened to completely break down her already weakened bodily defenses. "I can't keep walking anymore," she admitted to herself, feeling her legs dangerously shaking. "But I also can't stop here in the middle of nowhere, alone and vulnerable." It was then that Susan spotted a dirt road that extended beyond the urban area, winding through a rural landscape dotted with ancient trees and low hills that stood out against the dark horizon like giant shadows of sleeping prehistoric creatures. Something in her disturbed subconscious drove her to follow that road, as if it were a predestined path that would lead her to the place where she should be at that crucial moment of her existence. Her bare feet were now slightly bleeding due to small cuts caused by stones and debris on the asphalt, but she barely felt the physical pain because the emotional pain she carried was infinitely greater and more penetrating. The dirt road was irregular and full of holes that made her constantly stumble, but she persisted in her journey, driven by an inexplicable determination to reach some destination that her conscious mind could not identify, but that her wounded spirit seemed to recognize as necessary and inevitable. "This road takes me away from everything I knew," she murmured, looking at the uncertain path ahead. "Perhaps it will also take me away from all this unbearable pain I feel." Approximately an hour after beginning her walk along the rural road, when the sky was beginning to show the first faint signs of dawn with a pale and ghostly clarity on the horizon, Susan's body finally succumbed to the impossible demands it had been forced to endure during that endless night of devastating discoveries and desperate flight. Her legs gave way without warning, her strength completely exhausted, and she collapsed in the middle of the dirt road like a rag doll that had lost all its stuffing, her consciousness gradually dissolving as she fell into a deep faint that temporarily protected her from the brutal reality that had become her life. The last conscious thought that passed through her mind before completely losing her senses was a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief for finally being able to escape the unbearable emotional pain that consumed her, and terror for the absolute uncertainty about what would happen to her in that isolated and deserted place where no one would know to look for her if something terrible happened. "Maybe it's better this way," was her last thought before darkness enveloped her. Maybe it's time to simply let everything go away and find peace in unconsciousness. When Susan finally regained consciousness, the sun had completely risen, and its golden rays filtered through a dense cover of ancient trees that curved over her like silent guardians of a realm forgotten by time. Her first sensation was one of complete disorientation, a profound confusion about where she was and how she had gotten there, as if she had awakened in a world completely different from the one in which she had fallen asleep. The smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and something else indefinable but disturbingly familiar hung in the air around her, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously natural and supernatural. When she tried to move, she realized that she was lying on tall, wet grass that had stained her robe with dirt and dew, and that her entire body ached as if it had been beaten during the night, each muscle protesting against any movement she tried to make. "Where am I?" she asked aloud, her voice sounding strangely amplified in the morning silence. "How did I get to this place that seems straight out of a nightmare?" When Susan managed to sit up and look around more carefully, the sight that presented itself before her eyes was so shocking and surreal that she initially believed she was having a hallucination caused by her medical condition or the psychological trauma she had suffered. She was surrounded by dozens of ancient headstones worn by time, some tilted at strange angles due to the sinking of the ground, others partially covered by moss and wild vegetation that had grown uncontrollably over decades of abandonment and neglect. The cemetery in which she had awakened was clearly a place forgotten by modern civilization, a repository of the dead who no longer had anyone alive to care for their graves or honor their memory. Enormous and twisted trees grew among the tombs, their roots probably intertwined with the mortal remains of those who rested there, creating a symbolic fusion between life and death that was both beautiful and deeply disturbing. "I'm in an abandoned cemetery," she said, the realization hitting her like a terrible revelation. It was here that my unconscious body decided to bring me, to the place where I now belong. The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on Susan, who realized how fate had conspired to literally place her among the dead at the moment she discovered that the living had completely rejected her. There she was, a woman with a terminal diagnosis who had just discovered that her own family longed for her death, waking up alone in an abandoned cemetery as if it were a symbolic preview of her near future. The tombstones around her seemed to observe her with a silent understanding, as if the dead resting there recognized in her a soul that had already begun its journey of transition between the world of the living and the realm of those who had departed. She felt strangely at home in that morbid place, more welcomed by the invisible presences of the dead than she had ever felt in the house she had shared with David and Diane during so many years of falsehood and hidden resentment. "You understand me, don't you?" she said to the surrounding tombstones, feeling less alone than she had felt in years. "You know what it's like to be rejected by the living and find peace only in the company of those who have already departed." Susan rose slowly, each movement causing waves of pain that traveled through her debilitated body, and began to walk among the ancient graves, reading the names and dates partially erased by time and weather. Many of the tombstones dated back decades, some even from the previous century, suggesting that this cemetery had been abandoned long ago when a new modern necropolis had been built elsewhere in the city. She noticed that several graves were of people who had died young, their lives prematurely interrupted by diseases, accidents, or other tragedies that time had transformed into silent statistics engraved on deteriorated stone. The wild vegetation had created a natural and untamed garden that gave the place a melancholic beauty, as if nature was slowly reclaiming this space of death and transforming it into something alive and organic again. "This place has more true life than my home," she murmured, gently touching a moss-covered tombstone. "Here at least death is honest, without falsehood or theatrical performance." As she explored the abandoned cemetery, Susan began to feel a strange sense of peace descending upon her, like a protective cloak, a tranquility she hadn't experienced in months since the first symptoms of her illness had begun to manifest. There, surrounded by those who had already completed their earthly journey, she didn't need to pretend to be well, didn't need to maintain social appearances, didn't need to worry about others' expectations or judgments. The proximity to death had always been seen by her as something terrifying, but now she realized there was a brutal and liberating honesty in accepting mortality as a natural part of human existence. The dead in that cemetery had found a peace that the living rarely managed to achieve, free from the betrayals, disappointments, and cruelties that characterized human relationships in the world of those who still breathed. "Perhaps you are more fortunate than I imagine," she said to the silent dead. "At least you no longer need to worry about the falseness and cruelty of those still living." It was when Susan was preparing to sit beside a particularly ornate tombstone to rest and reflect on her desperate situation that she noticed a subtle movement among the trees at the back of the cemetery, a shadow that moved deliberately and purposefully among the more distant tombs. Initially, she thought it might be a wild animal that had made the abandoned cemetery its natural habitat, perhaps a lost dog or a feral cat hunting among the graves. But as the figure approached, she realized it was definitely a human form, walking with careful and measured steps among the ancient tombstones. Susan's heart accelerated again, not exactly out of fear, but from a tense expectation about who this mysterious person could be who frequented an abandoned cemetery in the early hours of the morning, and what their intentions might be toward a vulnerable and lost woman like her. Who else would come to a place like this, she thought, watching the figure slowly approach. And what will this person think upon finding me here alone and in such a pitiful state? The figure continued approaching through the labyrinth of graves and wild vegetation, and when it finally emerged from the shadow of the trees into the golden light of the morning sun, Susan could see that it was a person whose outline seemed almost ethereal in the morning mist that still hung over the cemetery like dancing ghosts. The distance and the diffuse quality of the light made it difficult to discern specific details about the person's appearance or identity, but there was something about their presence that radiated a strangely comforting and non-threatening energy. When the figure finally came close enough for their words to be clearly heard through the morning silence of the cemetery, Susan felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of inexplicable recognition, as if that voice was familiar in some way that her conscious mind couldn't fully process. "You shouldn't be here," said the voice with a softness that carried both compassion and warning. "It's not yet your time to join us in this place of eternal rest." The figure that emerged from the shadows between the ancient headstones revealed itself as a woman of approximately 70 years, with loose grey hair that floated gently in the morning breeze, and dark eyes that shone with wisdom accumulated over decades of experiences that seemed to have etched every line of expression on her gentle, tanned face. Charlotte moved among the tombs with the familiarity of someone who had walked those paths thousands of times, her steps sure and confident even on the uneven terrain covered with wild vegetation and loose stones. She wore a long, dark cotton skirt and a simple blouse covered by a hand-embroidered shawl that suggested both functionality and a modest peasant elegance. Her practical but carefully maintained clothes revealing a woman who respected personal dignity even in humble circumstances. When her eyes met Susan's, there was an immediate and genuine compassion in them that contrasted drastically with the calculated coldness she had encountered in her own home the night before. "My child, you are lost in more ways than you imagine," said Charlotte with a soft but firm voice. "But perhaps finding yourself here among those who have departed is exactly where you needed to be at this moment." Charlotte approached Susan with careful, non-threatening movements, like someone accustomed to dealing with people in states of extreme vulnerability and deep emotional trauma. She immediately noticed the pitiful state in which the younger woman found herself. The robe stained with dirt and dew, the bare and injured feet, the disheveled hair, and the eyes red from crying and extreme fatigue that told a story of recent and devastating suffering. Without asking invasive questions or showing inappropriate curiosity about the circumstances that had led Susan to that unusual place, Charlotte simply extended her calloused hand in a gesture of unconditional support that demanded no explanations or justifications. It was evident that she had found other lost and desperate people throughout her years, caring for that abandoned cemetery, and had developed an intuitive wisdom about when to offer help without asking questions that could cause more pain to someone who was already suffering beyond any reasonable measure. "Come with me, dear child," said Charlotte, extending her hand with maternal tenderness. "You need care, warm food, and a safe place to rest before deciding what your next step will be." Susan hesitated for a moment, her mind still processing the surreal sequence of events that had led her from a devastating discovery in her own home to this mystical encounter in an abandoned cemetery with a stranger who radiated a genuine kindness that she had not experienced for a long time. Part of her questioned whether this could be a hallucination caused by her debilitating medical condition, the extreme emotional trauma, or simply the absolute physical exhaustion she had experienced during her aimless nighttime escape through the cold, deserted streets of the city. But when she looked again into Charlotte's compassionate eyes, she saw an authentic humanity and a serene wisdom that convinced her that this woman was real and that her offer of help was genuine, not a trap or manipulation disguised as had been her entire family life during years of well-orchestrated falsehood. For the first time in a long time, Susan felt she could trust someone without reservations or fear of subsequent betrayal. "I don't know how I got here," Susan admitted, accepting the extended hand. "But I feel this meeting wasn't a coincidence, as if destiny had conspired to bring me to you." Charlotte guided Susan through the abandoned cemetery, following an almost invisible trail that wound between the oldest graves until reaching a small adobe and wooden house built on the cemetery ground's edge, as if it had originally been planned to serve as the gravedigger's or caretaker's residence. The house was simple but well kept, with white-painted walls that reflected the golden morning sunlight, and a small porch covered by a flowering vine that created dancing shadows on the uneven stone floor. Pots of medicinal plants and wildflowers decorated the entrance, filling the air with natural fragrances that contrasted with the smell of earth and decay that dominated the nearby cemetery. It was evident that Charlotte had transformed this isolated place into a true home, a refuge of peace and simplicity that radiated a welcoming and comforting energy that made Susan feel immediately welcome and safe for the first time in many months, of growing tension and fear. "This has been my home for over 40 years," explained Charlotte, opening the light blue painted wooden door. "Here you can rest and recover for as long as you need, without rush and without judgments." The interior of Charlotte's house was as welcoming as its external appearance suggested, decorated with simple but functional furniture that showed signs of decades of careful use and loving maintenance. The walls were adorned with old photographs in wooden frames, hanging plants that created a natural and cheerful atmosphere, and shelves filled with books that suggested a woman of varied interests and intellectual curiosity who had remained active over the years. A small kitchen opened onto the main room, where the aroma of freshly made coffee and homemade bread created a sense of domestic comfort that Susan hadn't experienced in a long time, vaguely reminding her of the happy times of her childhood when her own mother was still alive and created a genuinely loving family environment. Charlotte indicated a padded armchair near the window and immediately began preparing a simple but nutritious meal, her efficient movements revealing decades of practice in caring for needy people who had found refuge in her humble home. "Sit and rest while I prepare something for you to eat," said Charlotte, already moving around the kitchen. "A person cannot face life's challenges with an empty stomach and a weakened body." While Charlotte prepared the meal, Susan observed with growing fascination how the elderly woman moved through the house with a natural grace and efficiency that revealed a lifetime of self-sufficiency and independence gained through circumstances she could only imagine. It was obvious that Charlotte had learned to live alone in that isolated place, developing practical skills and an inner strength that allowed her not only to survive, but to thrive in conditions that many people would consider challenging or even impossible. The way she took care of each domestic detail with meticulous attention, but without hurry or anxiety, suggested a woman who had found peace and purpose in a simple but meaningful life, dedicated to the care of the dead and apparently to the occasional rescue of lost souls like Susan, who found their way to that unlikely sanctuary. There was a profound lesson in observing that serene domestic routine, a practical demonstration of how it was possible to find contentment and dignity even in the humblest circumstances. "How do you manage to live like this, so isolated but so at peace with yourself?" asked Susan, genuinely curious. "You seem to have found something I never knew existed, a true inner serenity." Charlotte smiled as she placed before Susan a plate of food well seasoned with herbs from her own garden and a cup of strong coffee that exuded an aroma that promised both nutrition and emotional comfort. The meal was simple but prepared with a care and attention that transformed basic ingredients into something that seemed like a banquet for someone who had spent the entire night without any proper nourishment. Charlotte sat on the opposite side of the small wooden table, serving herself a similar portion and watching with maternal satisfaction as Susan began to eat with a hunger that she hadn't even realized she possessed until feeling the first taste of real food touching her parched taste buds. It was evident that Charlotte derived genuine pleasure from the simple act of nurturing and caring for another person, as if that were a natural vocation she had discovered and cultivated throughout decades of chosen solitude and silent service to those in need. "Serenity is not something you find, my child," Charlotte responded after a thoughtful sip of coffee. "It's something you build, stone by stone, through the most difficult experiences life presents to us." During the next 3 days, Susan remained in Charlotte's humble house as a guest who gradually transformed into a companion, sharing not only the physical space, but also deep conversations that extended from dawn until late at night. Charlotte proved to be an exceptional listener, allowing Susan to vent about her terminal illness, the devastating diagnosis, and especially about the cruel betrayal she had discovered in the secret conversation between David and Diane. The elderly woman never showed shock or judgment at the revelations, only a compassionate understanding that suggested she had heard many similar stories of human cruelty throughout her long and varied life. In return, Charlotte began to share her own experiences, telling stories of people she had known throughout decades of caring for the cemetery, lost souls who had found their way there in moments of extreme crisis and who had discovered internal resources they never knew they possessed when confronted with the most brutal realities of human existence. "You know, Susan, "I've seen many people arrive here broken and desperate," said Charlotte, serving more coffee, "and I've learned that sometimes we need to symbolically die to our old life before we can be reborn as who we truly are destined to be." Charlotte revealed that she had begun caring for the cemetery after her own personal tragedy, when she lost her husband and only child in an accident that left her completely alone in the world at 30 years of age. Instead of allowing herself to be consumed by the bitterness and despair that naturally accompany such devastating losses, she had chosen to transform her pain into purpose, dedicating her life to caring for the dead and finding a profound peace in accepting mortality as a natural part of the cycle of existence. Her stories were told with a wisdom that came not from books or formal education, but from the lived experience of someone who had faced the worst that life could offer and had emerged with a deeper understanding about the nature of human strength and the capacity for transformation. Each account was a lesson about resilience, about the human spirit's ability to find meaning and purpose, even in the most desperate circumstances. "Death is not our enemy, dear," explained Charlotte during one of their long nighttime conversations. "She is our most honest teacher, the only one who forces us to confront what really matters in life." During the second day of her stay, Charlotte took Susan for a walk through the cemetery during the golden hours of late afternoon, showing her the graves of people whose stories she had come to know through visiting relatives or old records she had found. Each tombstone became an opportunity for a lesson about different ways of living and dying, about people who had faced adversities similar to Susan's and who had found ways to transform their suffering into something meaningful and transformative. Charlotte spoke about a young mother who had died of cancer in the 60s, but who had spent her final months organizing a foundation to help other families in similar situations, about a man who had discovered his wife's betrayal shortly before dying, but who had chosen to forgive and use his experience to counsel others about the importance of forgiveness. Each story was carefully chosen to demonstrate that even in the worst circumstances, there were always choices about how to respond, how to grow, how to transform pain into wisdom. "See this tombstone, Susan," said Charlotte, pointing to a well-kept grave. "Maria Elena died at 36, betrayed by her family, but left a legacy of kindness that still inspires people today." On the third day, Charlotte began to speak more directly about Susan's specific situation, helping her to see her circumstance not as a hopeless tragedy, but as an opportunity to discover who she really was when stripped of all the external expectations and approvals that had defined her life until that moment. The elderly woman explained that often the greatest betrayals and abandonments served as catalysts for personal discoveries that would never have occurred in comfortable and secure circumstances, forcing people to develop internal resources and strength of character that would have remained dormant if life had continued following predictable and safe patterns. Charlotte challenged Susan to consider that her illness and the discovery of her family's falseness could be seen not as cruel punishments from fate, but as liberations from a life that had never been authentically hers, a chance to finally live and die according to her own values and choices, instead of constantly trying to please people who had never genuinely valued her. "Perhaps this crisis is exactly what you needed to finally become who you've always been inside," Charlotte suggested wisely. "Sometimes we need to lose everything we thought we were to discover who we really are." It was during a particularly intense conversation on the morning of the fourth day that Susan experienced what could only be described as a moment of profound enlightenment, a fundamental shift in her perspective that instantly transformed her from a passive victim of circumstances into a woman determined to take full control over the time she had left in life. Charlotte had been talking about the difference between surviving and living, between passively accepting what others decided about her life and making active choices about how to use each remaining day to create a legacy that was truly hers. The conversation had touched on themes of personal dignity, self-determination, and the importance of not allowing the cruel actions of others to define the value or meaning of her own existence. Susan felt something ignite inside her chest, a flame of determination and strength that had been dormant during years of life dedicated to pleasing people who had never truly appreciated her, a new and powerful energy that made her realize she still had important choices to make and the power to implement them. "You're right, Charlotte," said Susan with growing firmness in her voice. "I won't die as a pathetic victim who allowed others to control and define her life until the last moment." Charlotte observed with visible satisfaction the transformation that was occurring before her eyes, recognizing the signs of a woman who was rediscovering her own strength and determination after years of submission and futile attempts to gain approval from people who didn't deserve her efforts. The elderly woman had seen this metamorphosis happen many times throughout her decades caring for lost souls, and knew she was witnessing the birth of a more authentic and powerful version of Susan that had been hidden beneath layers of social conditioning and fear of rejection. It was evident that the young woman was finally ready to confront not only her mortality, but also the people who had abused her kindness and trust for so many years. Charlotte rose from her chair and walked to an antique cabinet in the corner of the room, from which she removed a dark wooden box that showed signs of considerable age but had clearly been maintained with special care over the years. "Susan, the time has come for you to receive something that may completely change the course of this situation," said Charlotte, holding the mysterious box. "This belonged to a woman who went through the same thing you're going through, and she asked me to give it to someone who needed it as much as she did." Charlotte placed the box on the table before Susan with a reverent care that suggested its contents possessed a profound and potentially transformative meaning. The box was made of hand-carved dark wood with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a visual story of struggle and triumph, its corners reinforced with metal that had developed a greenish patina over decades of existence. A small golden key was attached to the bottom of the box by a fine chain, and when Charlotte unlocked it, a subtle aroma of cedar and thyme escaped from the interior like sighs of long-kept memories. The inside of the box was lined with dark blue velvet that had faded slightly, but still maintained its original elegance, and contained objects that seemed to have been carefully selected and preserved with a specific purpose in mind. It was evident that this box had belonged to someone who had faced extraordinary circumstances and had decided to leave tools to help others in similar situations. "This box contains the weapons you will need to defend yourself and avenge those who tried to destroy you," Charlotte explained with seriousness. "Use them wisely, but use them without hesitation when the right time comes." Charlotte explained that the previous owner of that box had been a retired teacher who discovered that her own family was planning to commit her to a nursing home to take control of her considerable inheritance, and that she had used the recorder to document incriminating conversations that were later used as evidence in a legal process that resulted in the imprisonment of 2 of her children for attempted fraud and elder abuse. The story served as an inspiring example of how a seemingly vulnerable person could use intelligence, careful planning, and concrete evidence to turn a situation of victimization into an opportunity for justice and legitimate revenge against those who tried to exploit her fragility. "This recorder was my salvation when I discovered that my own children wanted to rob me," Charlotte explained, showing the device. "Now it can be your secret weapon to confront those who think you are just a helpless victim." Susan held the small recorder in her hands as if she were holding a powerful weapon, feeling for the first time in many months that she possessed some kind of real power to confront the impossible situation in which she found herself. Charlotte meticulously taught her how to operate the device, how to hide it so that recordings could be made without detection, and how to transfer the recordings to a secure location where they could not be destroyed or suppressed by desperate people trying to cover up their crimes. During the following hours, the 2 women elaborated a detailed plan that would allow Susan to return to her home with a clear strategy to confront David and Diane, document their confessions, and gather sufficient evidence to ensure they faced appropriate legal consequences for their cruel and greedy plans. It was a plan that required courage, perfect timing, and an unwavering determination to see justice prevail over family betrayal. But Charlotte had taught Susan that she possessed all these resources within herself, just waiting to be activated by necessity and determination. "Remember, my daughter, you are no longer alone in this fight," said Charlotte, embracing Susan before her departure. "You now carry the tools and wisdom necessary to reclaim your power and dignity." The next morning, Susan carefully prepared for her return to the house she had abandoned in panic and despair just a few days before, but now approached with a completely different mindset, armed not only with concrete evidence and a strategic plan, but mainly with a profound internal transformation that had converted her from passive victim to determined warrior. She wore her best clothes, combed her hair with special care, and applied enough makeup to hide the signs of fatigue and trauma from the last few days, creating an appearance of strength and determination that would immediately communicate to David and Diane that something fundamental had changed in her absence. The recorder was discreetly hidden in a special pouch that Charlotte had sewn into the interior of her jacket, positioned to clearly capture conversations without being detected even by suspicious or paranoid people. Susan mentally practiced the words she would use, the questions she would ask, and the strategies she would employ to make David and Diane incriminate themselves through their own admissions and defensive reactions. Today they will discover that they completely underestimated the woman they thought they had broken, she thought, checking one last time if the recorder was working. I will show them that Susan never died. She just was reborn stronger and more dangerous than they ever imagined. The path back to her old house seemed simultaneously familiar and completely strange, as if she were visiting a location from her childhood that had fundamentally changed in her absence, although physically everything remained exactly the same. The streets she had traveled for years now seemed like scenes from a movie about another person's life, a naive and confident woman who had symbolically died on the night she discovered her family's betrayal. Susan observed the house where she had lived for 15 years with new eyes, noticing details she had never perceived before: how well-maintained and valuable the property was, how its privileged location represented a significant financial investment, how each improvement she had made over the years had increased the value that David and Diane so coveted. The irony of having worked hard to improve a property that her own beneficiaries were eager to sell as soon as she died did not go unnoticed, serving as more fuel for the determination that now burned in her chest like a bonfire fed by justice. This house that I cared for with such love will be the scene of my revenge, she murmured, observing the familiar windows. Right here they will confess their crimes and face the consequences of their greed and cruelty. Susan took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, a deliberate choice to announce her arrival formally, instead of simply entering with her keys, symbolically signaling that she was no longer returning as the submissive wife and obedient mother-in-law who had left that house, but as a visitor with specific purposes and power to implement them. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, followed by a prolonged silence that suggested surprise and possibly panic on the other side of the door, as if David and Diane needed time to process the impossibility that she had returned when they probably considered her permanently disappeared or even dead. When the door finally opened, revealing David with an expression of absolute shock that quickly transformed into suspicion and poorly disguised irritation, Susan maintained an upright and confident posture that immediately communicated that something fundamental had changed in her personality and determination during her mysterious absence. The man who had coldly rejected her in her moment of greatest need now found himself facing a woman who radiated a strength and determination that he clearly did not recognize nor knew how to interpret. "Susan, where the hell have you been?" "We thought that," David began, but was interrupted before he could complete any convenient lie. "You left us extremely worried with your inexplicable and irresponsible disappearance." "Hello, David," said Susan with a controlled calmness that perfectly masked the storm of emotions boiling beneath her serene surface. "I need to talk to you and Diane about some very important matters I've recently discovered." David instinctively backed away, allowing Susan to enter the house with an authority he had not seen in her during all the years of marriage, his body posture revealing a mixture of surprise, irritation, and something that seemed dangerously close to fear in the face of the evident transformation that had occurred in his wife during her unexplained absence. Susan walked directly to the living room where everything had begun, where she had received the cold and calculated reactions after revealing her terminal diagnosis, and where she now intended to confront those responsible for years of falsity and the cruel plans she had accidentally discovered. Diane emerged from the kitchen with the same expression of shock and discomfort that David had demonstrated, but her small, calculating eyes quickly began to assess the situation, trying to determine how much Susan might know about their secret conversations and what risks her unexpected presence could pose to the plans they had so carefully elaborated. The tension in the room was palpable, creating an atmosphere charged with expectation and danger that made every word and movement seem loaded with potentially explosive meaning. "Diane, it's good that you're here too," said Susan, keeping her voice dangerously calm. "We'll save time dealing with everything at once, without need for repetitions or misunderstandings." Susan positioned herself strategically in the center of the room, where the recorder hidden in her jacket would have the best chance of clearly capturing the voices of all participants in the conversation she was about to initiate, while David and Diane instinctively positioned themselves defensively, as if preparing to face a threat they did not fully comprehend, but recognized as potentially dangerous to their interests. The woman who had left that house as a desperate refugee now occupied the space with a dominant presence that forced others to react to her initiatives instead of controlling the dynamics of the situation as they had done during years of subtle manipulation and psychological domination. Susan allowed a moment of silence to stretch across the room, observing how David and Diane became increasingly uncomfortable and suspicious, their body language revealing growing nervousness in the face of a version of Susan they clearly didn't know how to interpret or control. It was evident that both were trying to determine how much she might know about their secret activities and what strategies they should employ to minimize any potential damage her unexpected presence could cause to the plans they had constructed so meticulously. "I imagine you're wondering where I've been during the last few days," said Susan, carefully observing their reactions. "And you're probably even more curious about what I discovered during my absence that brought me back here with such determination." David tried to assume a posture of marital authority, crossing his arms and adopting an expression of irritation that clearly intended to intimidate Susan and force her to return to the submissive role she had played during years of apparently harmonious marriage. However, his attempt at psychological domination encountered a resistance he wasn't prepared to face, an inner strength that Susan had discovered during her days with Charlotte, and that now radiated from her like an invisible armor that made his old manipulation tactics completely ineffective. Diane also tried to resume her traditional role of authoritarian mother-in-law, positioning herself in a way that suggested she expected Susan to explain herself and apologize for her irresponsible behavior, but discovered that the woman before her was no longer the obedient daughter-in-law, eager for approval that she had known for so many years. It was as if a fundamental switch had been activated in Susan's personality, transforming her from a person who constantly sought to please others into someone who now prioritized her own dignity and justice above any need for superficial harmony or external approval. "Susan, you owe us an explanation for your irresponsible disappearance," said David, trying to regain control of the situation. "You can't simply leave home like a rebellious child and then come back expecting everything to continue normally." "You're absolutely right, David," Susan responded with a serenity that contained a subtle threat. "I really do owe you a very detailed explanation about many things I've recently discovered." Susan began her confrontation methodically, first revealing that she had overheard the secret conversation between David and Diane in the early morning of her escape, observing with growing satisfaction how both paled and exchanged looks of absolute panic as they realized that their most intimate and incriminating plans had been discovered by exactly the person they intended to deceive and exploit. She described in specific details each cruel comment she had heard, each greedy plan they had elaborated, each expression of contempt and impatience regarding her imminent death, transforming their own words into weapons that were now directed against them with surgical precision that made any denial or attempt at minimization impossible. David tried to interrupt several times with weak explanations and transparent excuses, but Susan continued her exposition relentlessly, like a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence in a court where the defendants had already been found guilty. Diane tried to adopt an expression of wounded innocence, but her attempts at emotional manipulation met a Susan who had become immune to such tactics through her fundamental transformation. "How you talked about selling the house I inherited from my parents, as if it were just a convenient business transaction," said Susan, her voice loaded with controlled accusation. "And you discussed my life insurance as if it were a lottery prize that had finally arrived." David tried to deny the accusations, with a vehemence that only served to confirm his guilt, his denials becoming increasingly desperate and contradictory as Susan revealed specific details that only someone who had listened to the entire conversation could know. Diane adopted a different strategy, trying to justify her words as necessary practical concerns that any responsible family should discuss when confronted with a terminal illness. But her explanations sounded empty and manipulative in the face of clear evidence that her feelings towards Susan were based on greed and resentment, instead of love or genuine concern. The atmosphere in the room became increasingly tense and hostile as the masks of civility and family affection were removed, revealing the true personalities and motivations that had been carefully hidden during years of social performance. It was evident that David and Diane were beginning to realize that their situation was becoming dangerous and that Susan was no longer the vulnerable and controllable woman they had known for so many years. "Susan, you're misinterpreting conversations you heard out of context," said David, visibly sweating. "Any family needs to discuss practical matters when facing serious medical situations like yours." "Really, David? Then can you explain how practical matters include phone calls about plans that you can finally execute?" replied Susan, watching him squirm. "And how does this relate to Diane saying that I've always been a burden that prevented you from truly living?" It was at this moment that Susan revealed her most powerful card, removing the small recorder from her jacket and placing it on the coffee table with a deliberate and theatrical movement that left David and Diane completely paralyzed with horror as they realized that all their incriminating words had potentially been documented and preserved as evidence that could be used against them in devastating legal or social proceedings. The small but professional device seemed to grow in symbolic importance as it sat there on the table, representing not just the possibility of public exposure of their moral crimes, but also the complete transformation of the power dynamics in the room, where Susan now controlled information that could utterly destroy the reputations and possibly the freedoms of David and Diane. The way she had revealed the recorder, with perfect timing and maximum psychological impact, demonstrated that her transformation had included not just inner strength and determination, but also strategic and manipulation skills that rivaled those that had been used against her during so many years of apparently harmonious family life. "This little device contains very interesting conversations recorded during my absence," said Susan, lightly touching the recorder. "Conversations that reveal exactly who you really are behind your masks of a loving and concerned family." David reacted to the recorder as if it were a bomb about to explode, his carefully maintained composure completely disintegrating in the face of the realization that his most incriminating and revealing words had been captured and preserved by someone who now possessed the power to use them to destroy everything he had built in terms of social reputation and family status. Diane also completely lost her facade of concerned and caring mother-in-law, revealing an expression of anger and fear that showed her true manipulative and cruel personality that had been hidden under years of carefully orchestrated social performance. Both began speaking simultaneously, trying to explain, justify, minimize, and deny, creating a chorus of desperation that only served to further confirm the guilt that Susan had exposed with such precision and determination. It was evident that they were beginning to realize that they had completely underestimated the woman they thought they had broken and controlled, and that they now faced an opponent who possessed not only devastating evidence, but also the determination necessary to use it without mercy or hesitation. "Susan, you can't be recording private conversations without our consent," Diane desperately protested. "That's illegal and invalid as evidence of anything you think it proves." "How interesting, Diane, that your first concern is about the legality of the recordings," Susan responded with a cold smile. "Instead of denying the content of the conversations or expressing any remorse for what you said about wishing for my death." Susan then revealed that she had spent the last few days not only recovering from her devastating discovery, but also consulting lawyers specialized in family and criminal law, learning about her legal rights regarding her properties and inheritances, and discovering that the recordings she had made were perfectly admissible as evidence in judicial proceedings related to attempted fraud, abuse of vulnerable persons, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. She explained how she had documented Not only the initial conversations she had accidentally overheard, but also additional conversations she had strategically provoked during phone calls made from external locations, where David and Diane had incriminated themselves even further by discussing specific details of their plans and motivations. The revelation that she had been much more active and strategic during her absence than they had imagined created a new wave of panic and despair, especially when she mentioned that copies of all recordings had been deposited with lawyers and that specific instructions had been left about how to proceed if something happened to her before the situation was properly resolved. It was a demonstration of planning and determination that showed how Susan had transformed from a passive victim into a formidable adversary who had not only discovered their crimes, but had taken practical measures to ensure they faced appropriate consequences. "You spent years planning how to benefit from my death," said Susan, keeping her voice controlled but loaded with authority. "Now you will discover that I planned equally well how to protect myself from your schemes and ensure you pay for every moment of suffering you caused me." The situation in the room had completely transformed, with David and Diane now clearly in the position of desperate defendants trying to find some way to minimize the damage their own words and actions had caused, while Susan controlled the dynamics of the confrontation. With an authority and determination they clearly didn't know how to combat or neutralize. Susan outlined her demands clearly and non-negotiably. She wanted full control over all her properties and finances restored immediately. She wanted David to leave the house she had inherited from her parents. She wanted Diane to remove all her belongings and find somewhere else to live. And she wanted a written confession of everything they had planned to do with her assets after her death. Her demands were presented not as requests or negotiations, but as ultimatums that would be implemented with or without their cooperation, using the recordings as legal evidence if necessary. It was a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed in the house for years, where now Susan dictated the terms and David and Diane were forced to react defensively to her initiatives and demands. "You have a very simple choice," said Susan, rising to a position that physically dominated the room. "You can voluntarily cooperate with my demands and try to preserve some vestige of dignity, or you can force me to resolve this situation through legal channels that will make your actions public and the consequences much more severe." It was at this critical moment that David, realizing that all his attempts at manipulation, denial and justification had completely failed, and confronted with the reality that Susan possessed irrefutable evidence of his moral and possibly legal crimes, made a desperate decision that revealed the truly impulsive and desperate character he had hidden beneath his facade of civilized husband throughout all the years of marriage. In a moment of desperation, he tried to grab the recorder. But in the confusion that followed, Susan ended up injured and losing consciousness. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying, with David and Diane realizing that their attempt to resolve the situation through desperate means had only made everything infinitely worse and more complicated. "My God, what have you done?" whispered Diane, looking at the unconscious Susan on the floor. "Now we really have a much bigger problem than any recording could have caused." When Susan regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital environment with white walls and the characteristic smell of disinfectant that now brought her complex memories of past medical consultations. But this time, there was a fundamental difference. She wasn't there as a helpless victim of a disease she couldn't control, but as a survivor of an attempt to silence her that had completely failed. The small recorder that David had desperately tried to destroy was safe in the hands of the competent authorities, along with all the additional evidence she had carefully preserved during her days of planning with Charlotte. Dr. Mitchell was beside her hospital bed, but this time his expression carried not just the gravity of a terminal diagnosis, but also genuine admiration for a patient who had demonstrated extraordinary strength of character in the face of circumstances that would have broken many people. The nurse, checking her vital signs quietly, commented that she had rarely seen someone with such determination and clarity of purpose, even after a head trauma that could have been much more serious if not for luck and the natural resistance of her body. "Dr. Susan, you gave us quite a scare, but fortunately there is no permanent neurological damage," said Dr. Mitchell with evident relief. But I'm even more impressed to know that you used your intelligence to protect yourself from people who clearly didn't deserve your trust." The first official visit Susan received in the hospital was from the detective, an experienced man of approximately 50 years who had spent decades investigating family crimes and who immediately recognized the gravity and complexity of the case being presented through the recordings she had provided to the authorities. He explained that the evidence documented by Susan not only confirmed attempts at financial exploitation and emotional abuse, but also revealed elements of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and manipulation of legal documents that significantly elevated the seriousness of the charges that would be brought against David and Diane. The detective had listened to the recordings multiple times and was particularly impressed with the clarity of the confessions and the meticulous way Susan had documented not just casual conversations, but also specific planning that demonstrated premeditation and clear criminal intent. It was evident that he considered the case as a perfect example of how an apparently vulnerable victim could use intelligence and strategic planning to transform a situation of victimization into an opportunity for complete legal justice. Ms. Susan, in my 25 years of police career, I have rarely seen evidence so complete and well organized, said the detective with professional admiration. Your recordings are absolutely devastating for the accused and leave no room whatsoever for denial or attempts at minimization. During the next few hours, Susan provided a detailed testimony about the entire sequence of events that had led to the discovery of her family's betrayal, from the initial diagnosis of terminal cancer to the accidental conversation she had overheard in the early morning hours, her desperate escape, the transformative encounter with Charlotte, and finally her strategic return to confront David and Diane with irrefutable evidence of their moral and legal crimes. The detective and the prosecutor accompanying him were particularly interested in the details about how she had planned and executed the additional recordings, demonstrating an investigative sophistication that impressed experienced professionals accustomed to dealing with complex cases of family and financial crime. Susan methodically described each recorded conversation, each incriminating admission, each moment when David and Diane had revealed their true motivations and feelings regarding her illness and imminent death, creating a solid legal framework that would ensure they faced all appropriate consequences for years of falsehood, manipulation, and criminal planning. It's important that you understand, Ms. Susan, that beyond the issues of emotional abuse and financial conspiracy, the attempt to physically silence you elevated this case to attempted homicide, explained the prosecutor with seriousness. Your evidence ensures that the defendants face the full weight of the law for all the crimes they committed against you. While Susan was hospitalized for medical observation, David and Diane were formally arrested in an operation that revealed not only the crimes they had planned against her, but also a series of other financial irregularities that subsequent investigations uncovered in their personal lives, including previous attempts to manipulate inheritance documents of other deceased relatives and tax evasion schemes they had been operating for years without detection. The arrest was particularly humiliating for both because it occurred in their own neighborhood, where all the neighbors and acquaintances could witness the authorities' arrival and their departure in handcuffs, completely destroying the social reputation they had carefully built over decades of public performance as a respectable and well-established family. Susan's recordings were played during the initial interrogations, confronting David and Diane with their own words in a way that made any denial or attempt at reinterpretation impossible, forcing them to face the brutal reality that they had been completely exposed by someone they had fatally and definitively underestimated. David and Diane discovered in the worst possible way that underestimating an intelligent and determined woman can be the most expensive mistake of their lives, Susan thought upon learning of their arrests. They spent so much time planning my death that they forgot I was still alive and capable of defending myself. During the 3 days she spent in the hospital, Susan received unexpected visits from people she hadn't seen in years, old friends and colleagues who had heard about her situation through the discreet media coverage the case had received due to its particularly shocking nature and the extraordinary quality of evidence she had collected. Many of these visitors expressed regret for having lost touch with her over the years, admitting that they had always felt that David exerted a controlling influence over her friendships and social relationships, but that they had never imagined the full extent of his manipulative and cruel nature. Some shared their own suspicions about David and Diane's strange behavior at past social events, seemingly innocent comments that now gained new meaning in light of the revelations about their true personalities and motivations. It was comforting for Susan to discover that her social isolation had been artificially created and maintained by people who had an interest in controlling her, and that there were genuinely caring individuals who cared about her well-being and who were happy to rediscover the friendship that had been interrupted by circumstances they now completely understood. "Susan, we always knew there was something wrong with the way David controlled your friendships," said her former co-worker during an emotional visit. "Now we understand that he was systematically isolating you to make you more vulnerable to the manipulation and control he exercised over your life." Charlotte arrived at the hospital on the morning of the third day, carrying a small suitcase with clean clothes and personal products she had collected from the house where Susan had left some of her things during the days of recovery and planning they had spent together. The elderly woman radiated a silent and deep satisfaction at seeing that the plans they had elaborated together had been executed with complete success, resulting not only in the exposure of David and Diane's crimes, but also in Susan's definitive transformation from passive victim to a woman who had completely reclaimed her personal power and dignity. Charlotte had followed the unfolding of events through contacts in the community and was particularly proud of how Susan had demonstrated the inner strength and determination that she had recognized and nurtured during their days together at the cemetery and in the simple house that had become a sanctuary of healing and transformation. It was evident that Charlotte considered Susan's success as a validation of her own life philosophy about the human spirit's capacity to transform and grow even in the most adverse and desperate circumstances. "My dear child, you have done much more than simply take revenge on cruel people," said Charlotte, holding Susan's hand with maternal tenderness. "You have proven to yourself and to the world that your life has invaluable worth and that no one can take away your dignity without your permission. The decision was based not on fear or desire to escape painful memories, but on a deep understanding that the true wealth of life was not in material properties or social status, but in the quality of human relationships and the inner peace that came from living according to her own values and principles." Charlotte had offered her house as a place of healing and transformation, and Susan had discovered that that humble environment provided a serenity and contentment she had never experienced during years of living in a materially comfortable but emotionally toxic house. "Charlotte, your simple house offers me more true wealth than any luxurious property could provide," said Susan during her first night back at the refuge that had become her true home. "Here I found not just physical safety, but also the spiritual peace I had been looking for all my life without knowing." The following months were the most significant and satisfying of Susan's life, not despite her terminal medical condition, but in a way because of the clarity and urgency that the proximity of death had brought to her personal priorities and values. She spent her days helping Charlotte take care of the abandoned cemetery, learning about the stories of the people buried there, and discovering a deep connection with the natural cycle of life and death that had always existed, but that she had never taken time to understand and appreciate. Charlotte shared decades of accumulated wisdom through her own experiences of loss, transformation, and discovery of purpose, teaching Susan that death was not the opposite of life, but its natural and dignified conclusion that gave meaning and urgency to every moment, lived with authenticity and love. Together, they cared not only for the physical graves, but also for the memories and legacies of the people who rested there, transforming the abandoned cemetery into a place of honor and continuity, where the past was respected and the present was lived with gratitude and serenity. "Susan, you have discovered what many people never learn during much longer lifetimes," Charlotte observed during one of their evening walks among the ancient tombstones. "You have learned that true victory is not in avoiding death, but in living each remaining day with dignity, purpose, and genuine love." During these months of peace and contentment, Susan also received regular updates on the legal progress of the case against David and Diane, who had been formally charged with multiple crimes including attempted homicide, conspiracy to commit fraud, abuse of a vulnerable person, and a series of other financial crimes that subsequent investigations had revealed. Both had initially tried to deny all accusations and hire expensive lawyers to minimize their sentences. But the irrefutable quality of the evidence provided by Susan, combined with additional investigations that revealed other crimes, had made any effective defense against the charges they faced impossible. David had been sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Diane received a 6-year sentence, both also being required to pay substantial financial reparations and forfeit all rights to any inheritance or benefit related to Susan's property or life insurance. Justice had prevailed in a way that was both satisfying and educational, demonstrating that even seemingly vulnerable people possessed powerful legal resources when used intelligently and with determination. David and Diane's imprisonment brings me no joy, but it brings me a profound sense that justice has been served, Susan said upon receiving news of the final sentences. They will face the consequences of their actions, and this allows me to die in peace, knowing that I defended my dignity until the end. In the last weeks of her life, when her physical condition had deteriorated to the point where she needed constant care, Susan was surrounded not only by the appropriate medical care provided by a nurse who visited daily, but mainly by the unconditional love and reassuring wisdom of Charlotte, who had become the family she had always deserved but never had. Charlotte cared for her with a dedication that came not from family or social obligation, but from genuine affection and deep respect for a woman who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and determination in the face of circumstances that would have destroyed less resilient people. During these final weeks, they shared profound conversations about life, death, forgiveness, justice, and the legacy that each person leaves in the world through their actions and choices, conversations that enriched both women and created precious memories that Charlotte would carry with her long after Susan had gone. It was evident that Susan had found in Charlotte's simple house not just a place to die, but a place to complete her life in a meaningful and satisfying way. "Charlotte, you have given me the greatest gift that any human being can offer another," Susan said during one of her last conscious conversations. "You taught me that I always had value and dignity, even when others tried to convince me otherwise." Susan died on a sunny spring morning, surrounded by the serenity of the cemetery where she had discovered her own strength, in the company of the woman who had become her true family, and with the absolute certainty that she had lived her final months according to her own values and principles, instead of trying to please people who had never adequately valued her. Her death was peaceful and dignified, without unnecessary drama or prolonged suffering, an appropriate conclusion to a life that had been transformed from victimization to triumph through courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination to defend her own dignity. Charlotte organized a simple but deeply meaningful funeral in the same cemetery where they had spent so many months together, a service that was attended by people who genuinely had loved and respected her, creating a celebration of a life that had found its true purpose and value in the final moments when many people would have given up fighting. The contrast between the peace and love that surrounded her death and the cruelty that had characterized her final years of family life served as a powerful lesson about the importance of carefully choosing the people with whom we share our precious existence. Susan taught all of us that true victory in life doesn't come from avoiding death or accumulating material wealth, said Charlotte during her simple but deeply moving eulogy. She showed us that real victory lies in living and dying with dignity, standing up for our values, and surrounding ourselves only with genuine love and true respect. 6 months had passed since Charlotte had buried Susan in the cemetery that both had cared for with such devotion, but the presence of the brave woman who had transformed her final months of life into a lesson of dignity and strength still lingered over every headstone, every ancient tree, and every corner of the simple house where they had shared moments of wisdom and growth. Charlotte, now 71, had religiously maintained the routine they had established with Susan, caring for the abandoned graves and keeping alive the memory not only of the dead who rested there, but also of the extraordinary woman who had proven that it's never too late to reclaim our dignity and transform suffering into purpose. The wooden box that had saved Susan remained carefully stored in its place of honor in the antique cabinet, waiting for the right moment to be delivered to another needy soul who would inevitably find their way to that sanctuary of healing and transformation. Charlotte knew with the certainty that comes from decades of experience observing the patterns of human life that another lost and broken woman would soon appear, because the cruelty and greed that had almost destroyed Susan were persistent forces in the world that constantly created victims. "Susan, my dear daughter, your story is just beginning," Charlotte murmured to the simple but well-tended headstone where her friend rested. "Your legacy of courage will save many other women who don't even know yet that they need to be saved." It was on a foggy autumn morning, exactly when the leaves were beginning to change color, creating a golden carpet between the graves, that Charlotte heard hesitant footsteps approaching along the path that led to the abandoned cemetery. A young woman of approximately 30 was walking slowly among the headstones, her movements revealing the same kind of deep emotional pain and disorientation that Charlotte had immediately recognized in Susan months before. The newcomer had dark hair tied in a messy ponytail, clothes that suggested a hasty escape, and eyes red from crying that told a familiar story of betrayal, abandonment, and despair. Charlotte observed discreetly from a distance for a few minutes, allowing the woman to explore the cemetery and find some kind of initial peace in the silent company of the dead, before approaching with the same maternal gentleness she had offered Susan during their first traumatic encounter in that same sacred place. It was as if the cemetery served as a magnet for wounded souls who needed time and space to process pains that the world of the living could not adequately understand or accommodate. "You seem lost, my daughter," said Charlotte, approaching with careful, non-threatening movements. "But perhaps being here among those who have already found peace is exactly where you need to be in this difficult moment." The young woman was initially startled, but when she saw Charlotte's gentle face and compassionate eyes, her emotional defenses began to crumble like a broken dam, releasing a torrent of tears and broken words that told a painfully familiar story of a marriage that had begun with apparent love, but had deteriorated into psychological manipulation, social isolation, and financial abuse. Her name was Patricia, and she had discovered that her husband planned to use her debts to place her in an extremely dangerous and illegal situation, a revelation that had forced her to flee home with nothing but the clothes she wore and some personal documents she had managed to hide. Charlotte listened with the same infinite patience and wisdom she had offered Susan, recognizing the familiar patterns of an intelligent and good woman who had been systematically shattered by people who should have protected and loved her. It was evident that Patricia possessed the same fundamental inner strength that Susan had discovered, only temporarily obscured by years of manipulation and control that had convinced her she was weak, dependent, and incapable of surviving independently. "Patricia, dear child, you've come to the right place at the exact right time," said Charlotte, recognizing the familiar signs of a soul that needed saving. "I have a story to tell you about a woman named Susan who faced a very similar situation to yours and discovered a strength she didn't even know she possessed." During the next few hours, sitting on the welcoming porch of the simple house where Susan had spent her last and most significant months of life, Charlotte methodically told the entire story of the courageous woman who had transformed from victim to warrior, from the devastating diagnosis and discovery of family betrayal, to the elaboration of the revenge plan and the final confrontation that had resulted in the imprisonment of her tormentors and the reconquest of her personal dignity. Patricia listened with growing fascination and hope, seeing clear parallels between her own situation and the transformation journey that Susan had undertaken with Charlotte's help and the resources that a previous woman had left specifically to help other victims of family abuse and manipulation. Charlotte described in detail how Susan had used intelligence, strategic planning, and documented evidence to turn an apparently impossible situation into an opportunity for justice, demonstrating that even people in positions of extreme vulnerability possessed considerable power when they knew how to organize and direct it effectively. The story served as both inspiration and practical manual, showing Patricia that there were paths to escape situations that seemed to have no way out. "Susan taught me that we women are much stronger and smarter than our oppressors want us to believe," explained Charlotte, observing hope being reborn in Patricia's eyes. "She proved that true victory doesn't come from avoiding problems, but from facing them with courage and wisdom. When Charlotte brought the dark wooden box from the antique cabinet and placed it before Patricia, explaining how Susan had used exactly these same resources to document her family's crimes and ensure they faced appropriate legal consequences, the young woman held the recorder with the same reverence and growing determination that Susan had shown months before. Charlotte taught Patricia not only how to operate the equipment, but also how to develop a strategic plan, to gather evidence, how to contact appropriate authorities, and how to legally protect herself during the process of exposing and confronting her abusers. It was as if Susan's spirit was present in the room, guiding Charlotte in the transmission of not only practical tools, but also the inner strength and determination that would be necessary for Patricia to transform her victimization situation into an opportunity for liberation and justice. The box that had saved one life was about to save another, creating a chain of female empowerment that could extend indefinitely into the future. "This box contains more than equipment and documents," said Charlotte, placing her hands over Patricia's. "It carries the legacy of Susan's courage and all the women who came before her, and now that legacy passes to you." During the following days, Patricia remained in Charlotte's house following the same pattern of healing and strengthening that Susan had experienced, but with the additional advantage of having a complete success story to inspire and guide her own efforts of transformation and liberation. Charlotte shared not only the practical lessons she had learned from Susan, but also deeper philosophies about personal dignity, self-worth, and the importance of surrounding oneself only with people who offered genuine love and respect instead of manipulation and control. Patricia absorbed these lessons with a spiritual hunger that came from years of emotional deprivation, gradually discovering the strong and intelligent woman who had always existed beneath the layers of conditioning and intimidation that her abusers had carefully constructed to keep her submissive and dependent. It was comforting for Charlotte to see that her life philosophy and teaching methods, developed through decades of experience and refined through her relationship with Susan, were effective in helping other women in similar situations. "Charlotte, for the first time in years I feel I have control over my own life," said Patricia after a week of intensive preparation. "Susan showed me through her story that it's possible not only to escape, but to win completely." When Patricia was finally ready to return to the world and confront her own demons, she carried not only the recorder and legal documents that Susan had used so effectively, but also a profound spiritual transformation that had converted her from victim to protagonist of her own liberation story. Charlotte watched her leave with the same maternal pride she had felt, seeing Susan grow and strengthen, knowing she was sending into the world another warrior equipped not just with practical tools, but with the wisdom and determination necessary to use these tools effectively. The simple house in the abandoned cemetery had once again served as a place of symbolic death and real rebirth, where a broken woman had arrived and a strong woman had departed, carrying with her the legacy of all those who came before her. Charlotte knew that eventually she would receive news of Patricia's success, just as she knew that other wounded women would find their way there, creating an endless cycle of healing and empowerment that would forever honor Susan's memory and sacrifice. "Go with courage, my daughter, and always remember that Susan is walking beside you," said Charlotte, embracing Patricia before her departure. "When you win, and you will win, remember that you must help the next woman who needs the strength you've discovered." Patricia held Charlotte's hands one last time, her eyes shining with a determination that didn't exist when she had arrived broken and desperate just weeks before. It was evident that the young woman had internalized not just the practical lessons about how to protect herself and document evidence, but also the deeper philosophy about personal dignity and self-worth that Charlotte had shared through Susan's inspiring story. The transformation was so complete that Charlotte could barely recognize the frightened and submissive woman who had appeared crying among the tombstones, now replaced by a confident and strategic version that radiated inner strength and clear purpose. Months later, Charlotte received a letter from Patricia telling that she had not only successfully exposed and prosecuted her husband and sister-in-law for multiple crimes, including conspiracy for human trafficking, but had also established a small organization to help other women in similar situations. using the methods she had learned from Charlotte and inspired by Susan's story of courage. The letter included photographs of Patricia, smiling alongside other women she had helped escape abusive situations, a visual testimony to the multiplicative power of the legacy Susan had left. Charlotte kept the letter beside the few personal possessions of Susan's that she maintained as sacred relics, knowing that her deceased friend would be deeply satisfied to know that her struggle and sacrifice had generated a liberation movement that would continue growing and saving lives indefinitely. The abandoned cemetery had become not just a resting place for the dead, but a nursery for the rebirth of women who discovered they possessed much more power than they had ever imagined. In the letter, Patricia also mentioned that she had named her organization Susan Foundation in honor of the woman she never personally met, but who had saved her life through the example of courage and determination. Charlotte smiled, reading that the foundation had already helped more than 20 women escape abusive relationships and that several of them were now working as counselors to help other victims, creating an exponential network of support and empowerment that spread far beyond what Charlotte had imagined possible when she first handed the mysterious box to Susan. "Your story is being rewritten in every life we save," murmured Charlotte during one of her evening walks among the tombstones. "You not only won your own battle, you created an army of courageous women who will never again allow themselves to be victims of anyone. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.